The oldest canoe ever found in Africa is the Dafuna canoe. It was discovered by a group of Fulani men. Now, what's interesting about this canoe is that it shows a greater expanse of Africa than what we thought previously. But when does it date? Well, about 6000 BC. This is strange because 6000 BC would put us firmly in what is thought to be hunter-gatherer era. This is different, of course, than hunting and gathering because this boat is well made, meaning that these people had tools that were better than just basic rock and axe. Some things are even put to a point. In fact, if we read from Wikipedia the final entry, we can see that it's one of those things that crushes a lot of stereotypes because, of course, rivers are for travel, and travel takes away from a sedentary lifestyle where it expands far and wide.
The world is a strange place, and its history is long. When we look at the degeneration culture as mentioned by people, often what they're talking about.
The canoe has been radiocarbon dated at least twice and was dated to 6556 to 6388 BCE and to 6164 to 6005 BCE, making it the oldest known boat in Africa and after the Pesay canoe, the second oldest worldwide. It was probably created in a long-standing boat-making tradition and used in fishing along the Komodugu-Ghana River. It may have been constructed by members of a population group who occupied an area extending from the Western Sahara to the Nile of central Sudan and to the northern Kenya.
If this assumption is correct, it shatters almost everything we know about the history of Africa as presented by people who don't actually know the history, because, of course, historians paint a different history of Africa than what we normally see. It points to a Africa that is more dynamic or more nimble or more fluid in its history, one that does not rely heavily on hunting and gathering and being this one ignorant area of the world while the rest of the world is moving. In fact, it points to something stranger, something less tribal and more sophisticated. If there was a network of boats that went from 6000 BC from Egypt, Kenya, and all these other places, representing a culture, not that this one boat would travel from Nigeria all the way to Egypt and then back to Kenya, but instead representing a history. And of course, one thing I should mention is that this boat shows that there must have been boats before it because it's clearly not the first. It's not a dugout. It's not just like some simple dugout. It's a sophisticated boat. It's small, but still sophisticated. And in its sophistication, it shows a deep culture, a deep history. Now, this would be continuous with all the other things that I've put in these videos. For example, this would make it more fluid with the fact that cattle was first discovered in Chad and then spread from Chad to the rest of Africa, especially those same places that I just mentioned. It would also make sense why the languages would spread so far and wide within the African continent and also without. It would also make sense why people from all sides of this Chadic region have similar cultural dances and similar cultural writings and patterns and dress, even though we're talking about thousands of years ago. And we have seen with a dictionary from the Kingdom of Congo that language can last a very long time, but only if the languages overlap and keep overlapping over time. Otherwise, they will be completely unrecognizable from the other. It also doesn't surprise me that the oldest pottery in Africa, which is similar to that you find all over Africa after this point, was found in West Africa in Mali. Why would that be shocking? It is not shocking because we find a lot of centers of history in this area. You notice it's like Chad, Sudan, Nigeria, that general region. You find some of the oldest anything there.
Of course, I'm talking about a general thing that is above hunter gatherer, because of course we find most of the oldest stuff in East Africa and Southern Africa when it comes to hunting and gathering. An obvious example of this would be these sandal imprints found in southern Africa about 70,000 years ago, which takes away this thing of the barefoot African because they couldn't have built shoes. Now, I will let you know that in some parts of Africa, people were definitely barefoot, even if they were sophisticated, not because they were unable to create them, but a lot of times it had to do with something within the culture which needs to be explored because it's written down in some of the books of the Europeans where some religious men would not wear shoes. Could the Dafuna boat, to return back to it, have been a great influence on ancient Egyptian boats? Could ancient Egyptian boats tell us more about what the Dafuna boat was used for? Since this could be tied to a giant culture, I see why not. I see why not, why we shouldn't explore this option. There is a lot of talk about where ancient Egyptians get their ideas from, and it's funny that every now and then you find some early example of this thing in some other place in Africa, so that you do not need to explain it away by looking elsewhere outside of Africa, even though Africa had its influences far out of its own continent. Now, of course, I cannot talk about a boat without talking about food. So, for example, fishing would probably be something that they did. And why would they be fishing? Well, we know that fishing is just something that's been done even by hunter gatherers. So it's just common sense that they would do this, but it would be more efficient with a boat, and possibly even early nets could have been invented at that time. But maybe more than this, it could have been for bartering reasons, exchanging food from one place to another. And we know that this happened at least in ancient Egypt and in Eastern Africa with places outside of Africa like Arabia, because we find foods like the palm, which are native to Africa and thought to be native in Arabia, but might have been brought there by Africans. And then we find all kinds of other palms that are native to Africa and all kinds of foods that are native to Africa. And then we find some of them being planted in Arabia. We also find in Egypt wheat, which is not typical in Africa.
So definitely there was trade between the Arabian areas and ancient Egypt. And of course there was trade the other way around with things like obsidian and stuff like that that we find so long time ago being traded between these areas. Human beings do not just stay in one place. It is possible that these groups that we are considered one race or one ethnic group are an amalgamation of several groups that existed at the time. Not to mention the crossing from back and forth might have clouded our judgment. And now, today, we're looking for a group that is stagnant and we do not know what the hell we are doing. Anyway, it's interesting to know that we can find thing after thing that will completely shatter. It doesn't shatter, but it completely reinforces more well thought out ideas of ancient Egypt rather than silly ideas. Well, not ancient Egypt, ancient prehistoric Africa, rather than in reinforcing the stupid ideas by people that, Africans, for the most part, were doing nothing until maybe the 1400s. Notice this: people have been doing things forever.